Welcome to this panel discussion, Shipping, Addressing the Economics of Alternative Fuels. My name is Charles Goddard. I'm editorial director at the Economist Group. Shipping accounts for somewhere between 2 and 3% of global emissions, and its decarbonisation is a matter of real urgency and indeed complexity. Critical to the success of that are alternative sustainable fuels and possibly other energy sources that will define this transition, which needs to begin almost as we speak and certainly be well underway by 2030 if net zero shipping can be a reality by 2050. Ships have a 20-year plus lifespan. So indeed, that whole process needs to begin as soon as possible. What alternative fuels are in the mix and what market settings and regulations need to be in place to drive the fuel transition? What do governments need to do, and will we get there in time? I am joined by three very good speakers, very experienced and excellent speakers. Let me introduce them. Erik Noeklebye, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at Wallenius Wilhelmsen, the roll-on, roll-off and breakbulk shipping company. Maria Strandesen, who is Head of Future Fuels, Maersk Decarbonisation at AP Moller Maersk, the container shipping line, and Tahir Faruqui, who is Head of Downstream LNG at Shell, the oil and gas company. You'll find their biographies, their full biographies, on the screen under this media player. So let's jump straight in, shall we? And Erik, if I could begin with you. And of course, there are many challenges and questions moving from fossil fuels to alternative sources of fuel or energy, indeed, for shipping. Perhaps the most common question is that alternative or sustainable fuels are going to be more expensive than those that are currently used by the shipping industry in general. So if that's the case, how do we see a widespread adoption of alternative fuels happening?
Well, I think firstly, we don't have a choice. So this is something that we must do. And I believe we need to move fast towards a much more sustainable energy sources. And to itemize a few of those, that broader statement, we need regulations that's built on global standards and also enforcement, so same. We have to introduce emission-specific taxes and also market-based measures. I believe we'll come back to that later on as well. And the importance here is that part or some or all of that cash is then funneled back into R&D to really drive the development into those alternative fuels. I think we need scale in both production and supply of the alternative energy. And maybe most importantly, at the end, the need for us as consumers to eventually pay for the decarbonization of our globe. And those are, I think, some of those factors that we look at right now in terms of this being more widespread adoption.
So what comes first, the ships or the fuel? Because I think this is a question that is quite often raised, and it's a difficult one to answer, of course, but traditionally, I think shipping has been, as I think you mentioned earlier, an out-of-sight industry. Is it the demand from shipping that's going to drive the supply of fuels and the creation and supply of new fuels, or is it some other mechanism that we haven't yet put our finger on?
I think it's going to be a combination. I think any complex setup as we are facing right now, or challenge that we're facing, it has to require a widespread R&D focus. It has to require availability of cash also from the governmental side, I think, to really drive solutions. It's a challenge that, of course, goes beyond the shipping industry in terms of decarbonizing all parts of supply chains, all kinds of transportation modes. So I think the answer is it has to be a combination. There has to be, of course, close dialogue between those that builds the vessels and designs them in terms of also what type of technological solutions that are right now in play and also will come. I think also we need strong regulatory push and also change. For example, a fuel or energy source like nuclear, which has developed tremendously since what we know it in the past, is also there and under development. And I think that's also an area to really go, to one far side in terms of regulatory change and drive to really find this not, the single golden bullet for the future, but to really take that step. And then maybe the most important thing is an actual mind shift change. Mind shift change in terms of how we operate, in terms of how we collaborate, and also in terms of how customers are driving their supply chains. Because there's a lot of waste and inefficiency to be taken out there.
Well, I know we're going to come to quite a lot of those things shortly in the rest of the discussion, but just one final question before I move to Maria. Has Wallenius sort of identified at least a priority set of fuels that it would really like to work with in the future?
Right now, we are staying very wide in our focus. Of course, we are, as any other shipping line right now, looking at how to utilize LNG maybe as a first step, because it is there, but it is a transitional solution. So the question is how you stay flexible in terms of converting to something else that's going to come. At the same time, of course, we are a part of the discussions around ammonia, around hydrogen, around e-methanol and methanol that Maersk is leading on right now. I think what's important for us is to participate in the forums where the discussions are had right now, and I think also to then drive regulatory change. I mentioned nuclear in the beginning as well. We have to really find a proper carbon-free fuel that doesn't just create new challenges, new supply chain challenges, new emission challenges, so we can decarbonize, but we create something else, right? And I think that's where the challenge lies. And from that perspective, I think to zone in on one fuel option right now is not the time, I think. But we need much more R&D, and we need much more money spent on a wide focus right now.
Thank you, Erik, and I'm sure, Maria, you're going to take up on one or two of those points too. But can I just ask you obviously at Maersk, you've been working on identifying alternative fuel solutions now for some time, including, obviously looking at decarbonizing your operations as well as looking at intensively at all the different fuel options out there. What learnings have you achieved so far?
Well, first of all, we have learned that it is actually possible to decarbonize our fleet faster than what we originally thought. Back in 2018, we set the goal of decarbonizing our entire fleet by 2050. And a sort of sub-goal to that was that we would put the first fully carbon neutral vessel in the waters by 2030. That target we've now moved up to 2023, where we will put our first fully carbon neutral container vessel on the water, running on green methanol. So that is this first one of the learnings, is that we can do it faster than what we originally thought. Secondly, we've learned that it's extremely important to take into consideration the full life cycle profile of a fuel when evaluating it. Otherwise, we can sort of end up, making the wrong choices. So we learned that it's extremely important to take into account the emissions, not only while burning the fuel, but also in the production of the fuel, in the transport of the fuel, etc. And of course, we need to take into account not only CO2 as a greenhouse gas, but also the other greenhouse gases, methane and laughing gas, etc. And doing so is quite a complex task, but we learned that it's really important that we do that, and also it's really important that the legislators they take that into account as well when regulating future fuels. And then finally, we learned a lot more, but I'll end with the final one, is that the hen and egg challenge that you mentioned before, we encountered that as well when we announced that green methanol is one of our favorite fuel to pursue. We ran into this hen and egg situation where we were approached by a lot of green methanol producers who wanted us to sign, long offtake agreements. But then on the other hand, we didn't have any vessels that could burn the fuel, and So we were a bit reluctant to do, for instance, 10-year offtake agreements on a fuel we didn't have a vessel to utilize. But then we sort of decided to try and break the hen and egg challenge, and then sort of go ahead and order 8, or now it's 9 methanol vessels to be put in the water by 23 and 24. And that seems to, at least what we experience now, to have broken the hen and egg challenge. We are really, I wouldn't say swarmed, but we do get a lot of requests from upcoming methanol producers now. So that is, some of our learnings up till now.
I mean, I think our listeners would be interested to understand how and why you felt it was possible to move more quickly to decarbonize your fleet than perhaps others had been thinking. And for quite some time, it has been the view, I think, both in the shipping sector and those that support it, that it would be difficult and it would be a very long-term endeavor to try and decarbonize shipping. But you're saying actually it's possible, and it's possible quicker. How did you arrive at that conclusion?
Yeah, well, I think it actually dawned upon us that the technologies are more mature than what we thought. Now I say that we have green methanol as one of our favorite fuels. We are still looking at other fuel options as well, because I agree with others that there will most likely be more than one major future fuel out there, or carbon neutral fuel. But what we learned is that just taking green methanol, the engine is already developed. I mean, I think there are about 35 methanol tankers, who carry methanol as a cargo. They are already operating on methanol as a fuel. Of course, it's black methanol currently, but so the engine technology is there, and we quickly also learned that green methanol, it's a really easy fuel to handle. The regulation are more or less in place. It's a liquid, easy to handle fuel at ambient temperature. We don't need to cool it down or put it under pressure to have it on the vessels. And on top of that, you can produce it by multiple pathways, both via the E pathway, with green electricity and so on, and also through different bio mass conversion methodologies. So just all in all, we learned that it is, I mean, we thought it would take more years to sort of identify the technologies.
I mean, an interesting point that you raised too was that, well, at least Erik raised it, and I was just wondering whether it applied in any way, shape or form to the ships that you're planning to order, if you order ships that are not methanol ships, is the potential for flexibility in changing fuels once you already have the propulsion systems in place. And my guess is that there must be many potential for that. I mean, I think LNG is one of those fuels that could be potentially adjusted over time to other fuels. Am I right in saying that? I'm slightly out on a limb here, but am I right in saying that?
Well, yes. If you already have gas ships, if you already have LNG powered vessels, I guess of course it makes sense to investigate whether biomethane or e-methane could be an option, because of course we do not have any gas ships in our fleet currently, and based on our investigations, we find green methanol as a more sort of as a better alternative. So we are looking in that direction. Of course, we do also have green ammonia on the list of potential future fuels. But there is, as you probably know, quite a lot of safety issues that needs to be dealt with before we dare ordering ammonia fuel vessels, but that we are looking intensely into. And going back to what you said about flexibility, I should probably mention that the 9 methanol vessels that we will put in the water here in 23 and 24, they are all dual fuel vessels. So they are able to run on biodiesel or heavy fuel oil also, in case we cannot secure enough green methanol. I mean, we need almost 400,000 tons of green methanol as of per 2024. So that's of course a challenge. We haven't signed off-take agreement on all that fuel yet. So yeah, we have the dual fuel options to fall back on, so to say.
I mean, before I come to you, Tahir, could I just come back to you, Erik, and just to, sort of pick up that point. I mean, I asked the question very badly because I didn't quite understand the technology behind it, but dual fuel ships are they at least part of your plans for the foreseeable future, so that you're able to be flexible with the fuels if you need to be?
Yes, it is. So it is a dual fuel that we are focusing on as well for now, since it is a transitional phase. But that's also linked to access to fuel, just like Maria mentioned, and that's as much of a safety issue when are on the high seas as it is, maybe an emission perspective. Because sometimes we do go fairly long, maybe sea voyages are up to 60 to 80 days sometimes, and maybe there is not, you don't have access to the more environmentally friendly options during that whole voyage, and then you need that second source, and that's also a safety issue, as I mentioned already. And so, we can run marine gas oil or something similar as well as a dual fuel. But of course, right now, the dual fuel technology is the more carbon emitting option. Right, so it's just transitional. So at some point you have to move beyond that. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, talking about transitional fuels, Tahir, if I could come to you and Shell. I mean, Shell obviously is focused at this time on LNG as a transitional fuel for shipping, and I think more broadly for energy production as well. Where broadly is LNG as a shipping fuel at this point in time? To what extent has there been take-up, and what scope is there for further take-up of LNG?
It's a good question, Charles. It's a relatively new fuel in terms of its broad uptake, but it's actually quite a mature fuel as a propulsion solution for the marine sector, because remember, LNG carriers have been using this as a fuel for decades, 50, 60 years now. I've actually stopped saying LNG is a transition fuel. I've actually started saying LNG is a fuel in transition. And that's an important distinction to make, because when we see LNG's properties today, as Maria pointed out, we need to look at not just the carbon, but the full greenhouse gas effect, which is the methane slip that happens, at least used to happen in legacy technologies. But combined, LNG only gets you to 25% improvement versus legacy fuels. We're working towards net zero, and destination has to be net zero. This is where a lot of similarities come in between LNG and methanol, where what we're looking at is ultimately a world where you have green hydrogen available in prolific quantities, and it's being produced for different sectors. And methanol, the way you get to e-methanol is also using green hydrogen. So you look at synthetic liquefied methane, which is basically a net zero fuel as well. You look at that as the end state possible for this fuel. So it's not just a fuel for transition purposes. It's a fuel that is really in itself in transition, moving from fossil along the way with bio, eventually to synthetic using green hydrogen. Now, when you look at the world today, there's been significant uptake in LNG, especially in new builds. The problem with LNG is it has to be a new build ship. You can't convert existing ships on the water to LNG. You can do some retrofitting, it has to go to dry dock, but primarily the new fuels we're considering, all of them essentially need a new build platform. And if you look at the shipping sector, they were focused heavily up until 2020 on what was to be the IMO 2020 implementation, which was covering the sulfur regulation change. Since then, the market has started moving and adopting significantly towards LNG. Now, if I look at the container segment, the cruise segment, the bulker segment, the tanker segment, you've started to see an uptake in majority of all of these, at least the deep sea marine vessels, a gradual move towards LNG. It's still very much early stages, but you can see more and more it's gravitating towards that. But currently, as Erik pointed out earlier, you need a more stable framework for decision makers to adopt a fuel and make a transition. Right now, regulation isn't very clear on what needs to happen. There's ambitions, there's guidelines, but there's not a thou shalt do this, and that hasn't happened. So every decision that you see being made is on a voluntary basis. The two participants, my colleagues on the call, they've also made investments in future fuels, but they've done it on a voluntary basis because either their customers or their stakeholders are asking them to do it. But there is not a very clear guideline to do it. So everything that's happened is on a voluntary basis.
So I'm not sure that there's a great appreciation of this idea that you've just suggested, that LNG is a fuel in transition rather than a transitional fuel. And indeed, we've just been through COP26, and I think the broad sentiment there, I mean, whether or not that's backed up by the evidence, I'm not sure, but the broad sentiment is that LNG is very much a transitional fuel.
Well, Charles, you're absolutely right. It's not a common theme, because LNG today is associated, just by the very nature of the name, liquefied natural gas, it's associated with fossil. And everybody on this panel and everybody in the world wants to do away with fossil fuels. So the concept of bio is relatively new, and bio LNG is being adopted, biomethane is being adopted. Our focus at Shell is primarily road, because road, there is very clear infrastructure from a regulatory standpoint that says, how is bio LNG looked at? Bio LNG can actually get you to zero, but there's not enough of it. That's the problem. And getting to synthetic LNG, it's just an idea, because synthetic LNG has to come from green hydrogen. And today there's not green hydrogen that's available in mass quantities at scale all over the world. So it's more where it can take you to versus what's available today.
Okay, well, let's just park that for a moment, because I think there's some interesting thoughts being put here. But let's get on to this question, and it partly sort of relates to what you've just been saying, Tahir, about what the most effective drivers of the transition to alternative fuels might be. And of course, we have been, we've just been through COP26, and we've been hearing of the centrality and the need for carbon pricing or for a carbon tax. Or whether this is a straightforward levy or a cap and trade, or however it works, some form of incentive mechanism to drive this is going to be necessary. Can I just perhaps come back to, first of all, Maria or Erik, just to ask you, firstly, just to clarify, first of all, is this the same as, is this idea of a carbon tax or carbon price the same as a standard carbon tax for all industries, or are we looking at a specific price for carbon for the shipping sector itself? And if so, how is that going to be delivered and negotiated at the IMO, do you feel? Perhaps I can come to you, Maria, first.
Yeah, but to be honest, we are very much in favor of a worldwide carbon tax, and I think we've even put out the suggestion, the amount in $150 per ton CO2, and we are asking for that to be introduced as more or less as fast as possible, being phased in 23 at $50 per ton, and fully in place in 25 at these $150 per ton. I'm not quite sure. I mean, I don't think it necessarily have to cover only the shipping. I think we need to look at this in a sort of worldwide context, that these green fuels, they will replace fossil fuels in not only the shipping sector. So I'm not sure that it would be beneficial with only a carbon tax on the shipping sector. I think that might distort something, but yeah, that's my view.
Erik, your thoughts? We'll come to you, Tahir, just afterwards. Erik, your thoughts?
I very much support Maria here, and in saying that this is something we want as a shipping community. Under the body of World Shipping Council, where of course Maersk, not just as the global player they are, but also in that forum, we are signatories and strong supporters of this, and strong supporters that IMO is driving that. And I also agree, it doesn't have to be shipping only. I think we should start with shipping and get it going there, because it's so much of today's cargo is moved across oceans. But that it can apply to all kinds of transport modes, absolutely, because in the end it's the same principle that applies. So yeah, no, I very much support that.
And do you feel? I mean, obviously IMO has an important role to play in pushing this forward. Do you think that the member states of IMO are going to be behind this kind of carbon pricing if indeed the IMO supports it?
I think it's hard to predict the outcome of that. We know that the member body of IMO has a different complexity than maybe other types of organizations. I do think, and we think, that right now IMO sets a certain standard, and that's what we are looking for in terms of 2030 and 2050 targets, and also what's coming now in 2023 in terms of the carbon intensity index, etc. At the same time, as a company, we think that other bodies will accelerate regulation, ahead of IMO. So that, for us, that's just a baseline, and we need to be ahead of the IMO curve, to put it like that, up to 2050, because we think regulatory bodies like EU, with the EU Fit for 55 package and then the ETS coming, that's going to drive, I think, tougher demands, and you probably will have other countries around the world, large markets, that's going to drive probably a tougher approach to regulation. So it probably is going to be a mix, but maybe that can then lead also to support of an IMO, unified approach as well. So, but this is not a linear, straight approach. This is complex. But I do think that if we as industry take the responsibility, I feel we do that now. I feel we want this, and then we have dialogues with upcoming regulations like EU. I think that's going to be a catalyst as well.
Here, can I just jump to you? Do you think? Sorry, Maria, were you just going to say something there?
No, I would just mention that I mean, I think all the major shipping companies, they are also supporting a worldwide carbon tax and have set ambitious goals. So I think the industry is ready, and so please just help us in this transformation. And then a final note, maybe also on just on the regulatory side, we do foresee already now, or we do see it already now, that there are differences in how a carbon footprint of a certain fuel is measured in, for instance, Europe versus United States. So that has to be aligned somehow also. I'm not sure it's IMO that will do that, but there's some irregularities on the sort of how to measure the carbon footprint of the exact same fuel in different regions. So that's another issue to address in this worldwide discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. And Tahir, would Shell support a carbon price in the way that, say, for example, Maria and Erik are suggesting a fairly steep rise in the price of carbon too, starting in 2023 and then moving quite high to $150 per ton in 2025?
Yeah, I won't speak to the levels. I think definitely Shell is very supportive of this type of an archetype, and I'll tell you why I won't talk about the levels, because I think the tax is not meant to be punitive. The tax is meant to really recognize that the cleaner fuels are more expensive. So it's more intended to be about making it a level playing field to get these fuels to become affordable for the shipping sector. I think it is very important to recognize what Maria said, and I think Erik alluded to it as well. I think shipping is ready. Shipping recognizes this is something that needs to be done. But remember, shipping is also one of the hardest sectors to abate in terms of its CO2 footprint. And I think, at least in our view, the fuel of the future needs to be more ubiquitous. If you're going to penalize just shipping and have shipping pay for the future fuel, remember, shipping is a sector that has been using waste product from a refinery for the last several decades, right? So expecting this sector alone to bear the cost of the clean fuel seems too costly for just one sector to bear that cost. It needs to be borne across the sectors. And that's why the future fuel needs to be one which is actually more ubiquitous as well. It's something that is consumed by the power sector, by the different industry sectors, by other transport sectors. And I think this tax that we're talking about just simply recognizes that these fuels of the future are going to cost you more than the fuels that we use today. And how do you level that playing field? This is critical to do.
We'll talk about leveling playing fields. Just on a similar question, I know, Maria, that your CEO has suggested a worldwide ban on all fossil fuel ships by 2035, as I assume a means of creating a level playing field. I wonder whether that's feasible and reasonable, and whether or not certainly countries in the developing world will feel that that is not going to be particularly a level playing field for them. How did that arise, that decision, or at least that suggestion?
I think it spun out of the realization that I mean, all factors point towards the fact now that we need to decarbonize ASAP. I mean, we need to do it. I mean, in reality, I know we have a goal of decarbonizing our fleet before or no later than 2050. But in reality, we are trying to decarbonize ASAP, simply as fast as technically and commercially possible. And the reason for why we do that is it's sort of twofold. It's one being the fact that we recognize that we have been part of creating the problem. I mean, shipping emits 3% of the world's CO2 emission. So it's an acknowledgement of the fact that we've been part of creating the problem. So now we need to be a part of, creating the solutions, fixing the problem. So that's one reason. The other one is, of course, that we do see our investors and our customers expecting us to decarbonize. So if we are to stay in business, we need to decarbonize, as fast as possible. And we can see that our customers, I think just a year ago, 90 of our largest customers had set quantitative sustainability goals. And now, a year later, it's 200 of our largest customers that have all set quantitative sustainability goals. And they need us to help them fulfilling those targets and those goals. And I can see now we have an offering on the market called Eco Delivery, where we offer green shipping. We use biodiesel, use cooking oil, etc. to offer that. So yeah, we need to scale it with other fuels as green methanol. But what we do experience right now is that we experience higher demand than what we can offer. So I think there is all signs on the fact that we need to do it as fast as we can, and the world around us are ready. But of course, I think Søren was also inspired by this EU legislation coming out that they want to ban the production of combustion cars by 2030. So it was, I think, also inspired a bit by that thought.
It is an inspiring target. I think it's the right target too, but it may result in a few iniquities across the road. But let me just ask Tahir, you had your hand up to hear your thoughts.
No, I was going to say what Maria said at the end is critical. What Maersk has said is not unprecedented, because the automobile industry has already implemented that, right? At least in Europe, you have legacy fuel bans in place. Now, maybe where I would say is, I think it's actually bold and compelling to actually do what Maersk is talking about, because if you think about it, for the automobile industry, you're talking about a 5-year life cycle of an asset typically, yeah, versus ships, they're 20 plus years. So if you don't start talking about that ban right now, stopping any new build that's coming that's just purely working on legacy fuels, you're going to continue to perpetuate that problem. And we can't wait for 2030 or 2035 or 2040 or 2050. Our carbon budget is a finite bucket that we're working towards. And every new ship that gets built that is burning legacy fuels is contributing more and possibly exaggerating the problem. If you look at IEA, their World Economic Outlook now, or World Energy Outlook, sorry, says that based on current trend, not the commitments, but current trend, by 2030, it will be too late to get to 1.5 degrees or better. We're on pace for much worse. So you have to stop somewhere, somehow. And what Maersk is talking about is bold, but it's not unique because the automobile industry is already going through that, at least in Europe. So we should look to take something more dramatic.
Let me just briefly address a couple of other issues. We are certainly not going to be able to address all of the issues here in this session, but let me just briefly address one other issue that's important for if fuels are going to materialize. And of course, the fuels themselves are not going to materialize by magic, and there's still some discussion, obviously, about which fuels are going to be the optimal fuels and which ones are going to be the ones that are desirable and feasible over time. But at the same time, we need to be pushing forward investments in infrastructure in order to be able to get that infrastructure out there in global ports in order to be able to service the shipping. What roles, Erik, what role, should I say, do governments need to play in order to be able to start to A, make the choices about the infrastructure, and B, to start making putting in the framework, the investment frameworks in place in order to get this infrastructure rolled out, and indeed the investments themselves from countries, I think, to get some of this infrastructure rolled out?
I think first and foremost, ensure that whatever taxes are, coming, that, if not everything, but at least a large part of it is actually going back into R&D. It's going back into thinking around infrastructure and how this is going to be done. So I think that's because otherwise it's just going to be left back into the industry or private initiatives or country initiatives, etc. I think that's one important aspect. A little bit back to this fuel choice of future fuel, though. We're talking about energy, right? So what's the energy source and what's the renewable energy source? I think right now, it's hard to start to work on a specific infrastructure and supply chain for a specific fuel because we don't know yet what that fuel is. It's just too many choices and options still. And I think one challenge here is that some of the good options that we talked about today and that are there, they require a lot of renewable energy to produce it, right? And how does that supply look at, in 20, 30, 40 years from now in the world, given that there are so many other industries and, the planet itself, the energy demand is increasing. So are we in shipping left with sufficient amount of renewable energy to create these fuels in a green way? So I think for us, it's also about then, well, what's the energy source that can be used? Are we going back to wind type vessels? Can you optimize supply chains so you can actually reduce the speed of the vessels themselves significantly? So you can actually allow for different type of propulsion modes. To think really differently, because in the end, the stress from port to port is a part in the supply chain which is just unduly stressed right now. Because with better planning and supply chains, quite often you can actually take more time and you don't have to emit as much as today, and you can do it at less cost. So I think it's a little bit too early for me to say that governments have to start to push this or that. But they have to start to think around funding. How do we go about this? Because at some point there will be a need to a change on the infrastructure side regardless, because the current fossil fuel infrastructure is not going to be the one. And then we have to have funding in place, and we have to have operators like Shell in place, right? That they are allowed then to think downstream and upstream around this also as for us as operators. So not a very clear answer, but that's a little bit where I am.
Yeah, no, that was, obviously, as you suggest, there aren't enough options on the table really to make the decisions about infrastructure at the moment. But Maria, can I just ask you, do you share Erik's concerned that growing energy demand is going to make it difficult to get the supply right for all of the industries and sectors that would need to have some form of green fuels, and that puts shipping in a difficult position to some degree, at least, in terms of at least forecasting what fuels are going to be available in the future.
Yeah, I very much agree. I mean, the world really needs to ramp up on capacity in renewable electricity, and that can only go too slow. And so whatever governments around the planet can do in order to assist, in building up this capacity, that is really needed. I mean, in general, you could say that I think there's more or less a worldwide consensus on the fact that, when sectors are looking into how to decarbonize, you need to start with electrifying all you can electrify, because that simply is the most energy efficient way of decarbonizing. So you have to electrify all you can. Secondly, then you have to go for hydrogen as a fuel, either combustion or fuel cell, as much as you can, because that's the second most sort of energy efficient. And then after that, when you've utilized those two options, then you can look into liquid fuels, etc. And there we have to, I mean, they're both aviation. I mean, they're forced to look into liquid fuels as well as we are, especially on the deep sea shipping. We do have a little, I mean, we are looking a little bit at whether our, smallest container vessels, the ones that are going on a maximum round trip of 2,000 kilometers. We don't have that many that goes there, but those might in the future be able to run on hydrogen in a fuel cell scenario. But the deep sea going vessels, I mean, electricity and hydrogen is not going to cut it. We have to have the liquid fuels, and of course, there we will fight for the green electricity, no doubt about it. But that is sort of where we like the fuel options that can offer multiple pathways, like the green methanol. You can produce it by gasification of biomass, and you can also produce by use of electricity. So that is one way of trying to de-risk a bit, but there's no doubt about the fact that renewable electricity is going to be a scarce resource in the future, and we might have to look into options like nuclear. We don't have an official standpoint on the nuclear options. I know that Erik mentioned it, but for land purpose, to perhaps support the buildup of sort of renewable electricity, if you can call it that, that might be an option. Yeah.
So I like that framing, Maria. And just briefly coming to you, Tahir, just to end off, electrification, hydrogen, and then liquid fuels seems to me to be a good framing for how we make a rapid transition. Is that something that you would agree with?
Completely agree with my peers, Charles. The world has to get to renewables as the source, and the best way to capture renewables is hydrogen, because it's produced in locations that are disconnected from consumption centers. But then how do you take that hydrogen and bring it to these markets? That's where the derivation of that hydrogen, either you liquefy it, which is extremely energy intensive, or you convert it either into ammonia or methanol or synthetic methane. The reason why I talked about LNG as a fuel in transition was exactly that reason, because end state is still in our mind about hydrogen. But then how do you bring it to market and how do you consume it? Well, the beauty of LNG infrastructure today going to synthetic methane eventually is it essentially uses the same supply chain, the same pipelines, the same storage terminals, the same distribution vessels, where for other alternate fuels, you have to build it. For LNG based on fossil, it already exists. So we should not look at produced cost of the alternate fuel. We should not even look at distributed cost of the molecule. We should actually look at, for society, what is the consumed cost of this end state molecule. You talked about infrastructure. Well, for LNG, it already exists. LNG is available in major ports all over the world. All I have to do is change the molecule from fossil to bio or synthetic. For all the other alternatives, hydrogen, beautiful molecule because it has no carbon in it. but it has no infrastructure either. So you have to build it all out from scratch. So which is the most costly solution for society? We need to determine that. But that's also why the jury is still out. What is the solution that is going to be the most effective for shipping? Because the answer isn't obvious, but you can see the pathways. You can see it all ultimately leads to green hydrogen, to renewable energy as the source molecule. And as much as we can, we want to use renewables. Where I can't consume it, I convert it to hydrogen and try to use it as hydrogen. Where I can't use it as hydrogen, I then try to convert it.
Well, that discussion, thank you, Tahir, that discussion on the kinds of fuels that we're going to see emerging, and indeed which fuels give a value to society, a best value to society outcome, I think is a fascinating one. And we've, I think, managed to unpack a little bit of that here today. Thank you very much. I think one thing that's come out of the discussion really is this sense that I think the shipping sector is moving much more quickly now towards trying to find solutions, particularly in the fuel space and propulsion space, and that the idea of decarbonizing more quickly is something that certainly the big ship owners, the big shippers are certainly thinking of, as well as customers too, and that really there isn't really any time to lose. And I think on that note, thank you very much to all of our panelists. Let me just say thank you to Erik from Wallenius Wilhelmsen, to Maria from Maersk, and to Tahir from Shell for all of your contributions. Thank you so much.